welcome Dr. Nissa Finney, our second keynote speaker. She is a reader in human geography at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. Her work is concerned with residential experience and how this represents and reproduces inequalities. She is a member of the ESRC Center on Dynamics of Ethnicity, also Center for Population Change, and chair of the Royal Geographical Society Population Geography Research Group. She is an author of many papers, reports, and book contributions, including editor of Minority Internal Migration in Europe and author of Sleepwalking to Segregation, Challenging Myths of Race and Migration. Today, she will be sharing with us her expert opinion on the race, place, poverty, and the threat to home, patterns and processes of stubborn inequalities in Britain. Dr. Finney, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Merita, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody here from the sunny seaside in Scotland. It's really good to be with you, albeit at a distance. So I'm going to use slides for this presentation, which I will share with you now. So in the next half hour or so, I'm going to talk about the long-term experiences of migrants and minorities in housing. I'm going to make the argument that there is a serious threat to home for migrants and minorities, and that we can see this as spatial injustice. I'm going to draw on a number of projects and collaborations, and I want to gratefully acknowledge my colleagues on this work and the research participants and the funders, notably the Economic and Social Research Council. The empirical material that I'm going to present is UK focused, but I think echoes the situation in many countries, and the argument, I hope, has a broader resonance. So I'll begin by outlining the theoretical framing, namely ideas of home and spatial justice. I'll give a short overview of ethnicity in Britain, and then I'm going to present evidence for housing inequalities and processes of racialization and disadvantage. We are, of course, considering these matters in unprecedented times, when questions of racial and ethnic inequalities have risen to the fore. We've seen much discussion in recent months about institutional racism, particularly in policing, led by Black Lives Matter's campaigns. In the UK, we've seen what has become known as the Windrush scandal, where in 2018, immigrants who had been living in the UK for decades were illegally deported. And this year, we've seen very stark questions raised about how vulnerability and risk to coronavirus is not even across countries and within those countries across ethnic and migrant groups. So it's in this context of renewed questioning of ethnic inequalities that I make this presentation. So I want to frame the argument today with two concepts, home and spatial justice. Now, it's long been recognised that home has boundaries that are both physical and symbolic. There are material, emotional, cognitive, and social dimensions of feeling at home. And there's some wonderful recent work on domesticity and gender and home. And I'm thinking particularly of work coming from geography by Alison Blunt, Kathy Burrell, Sarah Marie Hall, and others, who reveal the everyday experiences of home and homemaking. However, what I want to focus on today are the material aspects of home, of housing, home as a structure, as a dwelling, the physical home. And this physical place matters for ontological security and physical well-being. And the idea of home, which is of course long-standing, was bolstered in the UK, particularly in the period after the Second World War, by investment in housing, national investment in housing, and particularly an allied political ideological commitment to housing as a right. And in recent decades, however, this has shifted dramatically, and the ideology of housing as an asset has come to the fore. And so the idea of the right to a home has been very much diminished, with the emphasis shifting from well-being to property and wealth. And I'm concerned with how this threat to a home has been unevenly experienced across people and across places. And East Hope's work is helpful here, pointing out that in countries where there's a normative preference for home ownership, which is the case in the UK and in her example of Australia, it's become increasingly difficult for those in the private rented sector, particularly, to feel at home. And we'll see later the relevance of the focus on the private rented sector. So East Hope writes that while the challenges facing renters in regard to their ability to feel at home is affected by the nature of the housing market, they are further exacerbated by residential tenancy legislation and policy settings that prioritise the needs of owners to mobilise their assets over the needs of tenants for secure occupancy. I want to couple these theories of the material home with theories of spatial justice as proposed by Edward Soja. And his writings were concerned with emphasising the geographical in the production and reproduction of inequalities, how the spatial situatedness of social processes is entwined with their nature and their products. And part of Soja's work and concerns in his work in Los Angeles was how processes of racism and racialization, and importantly for him, social movements and resistance, are emplaced. So I take what Soja calls and what he advocates for an assertive spatial perspective. And he speaks of spatial injustice and spatial justice being situated at different geographical resolutions. And in this presentation, I'm concerned with the local scale, where unjust geographies arise endogenously or internally from the distributional inequalities created through discriminatory decision-making by individuals, firms, and institutions. So, I want to make the argument first that the threat to home is patterned by race, and second, that this happens through processes of racialization that represent spatial injustice at a local scale. Before I provide my evidence for this, let me outline ethnicity in Britain. We have a representation of ethnic groups in England and Wales. I'm going to be using the concept of ethnic group quite a lot in the first part of the evidence that I'll present. And the ethnic groups here, as you'll see from the labels, include immigrants and their descendants. Now, there is a great deal of debate that we could have about ethnic group and migrant categorisation, but for now, I'll see these as very useful categories because they identify people in terms of race and migrant background combined. So for England and Wales, we see in the small circle that 80% of the population is white British. And the large circle shows that the remaining 20% is a very diverse mix, with the largest groups representing colonial, refugee and EU migrations over the last 50 years. There's a somewhat different picture in Scotland, where I am just now, with around 4% of the population identifying with non-white ethnic groups. And a really crucial piece of contextual information is differing levels of poverty between ethnic groups. Now this might seem like a simple table showing the proportion of each ethnic group living in poverty, but it's actually really difficult to obtain and calculate this information. We've done it using a survey called Understanding Society. We hear a lot more about educational and occupational differences between ethnic groups, but the inequalities are particularly stark when we think about poverty. So the table shows that for non-white minority groups, a fifth of households live below the poverty line, with the figure being a quarter for Black Africans, around a third for the Bangladeshi population, and 4 in 10 Pakistani households in the UK living below the poverty line. Let's move on to how this translates to experiences in housing and home. First, a story, a true story. A story of this tower block, Grenfell Tower in London. In June 2017, Grenfell Tower set alight. 72 people died. You can see most were not white. Grenfell Tower is in the London Borough of Kensington, a stone's throw, as this map shows, from Notting Hill. In Notting Hill, the houses look a lot more like this. No fires killing 72 as a result of substandard construction have been reported here. Now, the story of Grenfell Tower is an exemplar of ethnic inequalities in housing in one of the richest cities in the world, and how these happen at very local scales and how they can have dire consequences. To reinforce this spatial point, this chart shows the distribution of the neighbourhoods that different ethnic groups live in terms of poverty or deprivation. So the horizontal bar in each of these box plots is the average level of neighbourhood deprivation for people in each ethnic group. So, for example, on average, the white British population lives in neighbourhoods with a deprivation score of 15, low levels of deprivation. Though note too that there are white British people living in extremely deprived neighbourhoods. In comparison, in the centre of the chart, on average, Pakistani people in the UK live in neighbourhoods with a high deprivation score of over 40. Across these neighbourhoods, ethnic inequalities in housing are stark and persistent. This chart shows in each column the proportion of the ethnic group in home ownership in grey, in social renting, that's state provided accommodation in blue, and in private renting in red. I want to focus on private renting, which can be characterised in the UK as the most precarious tenure. There are 2 points I want to draw from this chart. First, in general, ethnic minorities have higher levels of private renting, precarious housing than the white British. And levels of private renting have increased more for ethnic minorities than for the white British since 2001. And this is indicated by the white figures overlain on the red bars, which show the percentage increase in private renting over the decade being considered here. So for many Black and African groups, private renting increased by around 20% over the decade, whereas the increase for white British was less than 10%. And this suggests widening inequalities in housing in recent times. And this is confirmed here with data for 2016, showing that by 2016, over half of some of the minority ethnic groups were living in private rented housing, compared to 16% of the white British population. Ethnic minorities are also more likely to live in houses that are too small for their families, using official definitions of overcrowding. For example, we can see in the grey segments the proportion of households in overcrowding for each ethnic group. And we see that for the Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Black African households, over a third are living in overcrowded conditions, compared to around 5% for the white British population, which you see at the right-hand side of this chart. These patterns do vary across the country. For example, we see here overcrowding for the white other group, which is largely recent migrants from the EU, particularly from Poland. And we see this for districts of England and Wales for 2001 at the top and 2011 at the bottom. It's not necessary to grasp the detail in these maps, but just to get a sense of the patterns and the changes between these 2 years. The darker the colour, the higher the levels of overcrowding for the white other population. So over the decade, we see that overcrowding levels increased, the colours get darker, and the experience of overcrowding spread from London and the southeast, the dark area in the top map, throughout England and Wales. To consolidate this evidence of housing disadvantage further, in this chart, I use an indicator of housing deprivation taken from census microdata. Those experiencing housing deprivation are, for example, those in overcrowded accommodation, without central heating, and with shared kitchen or bathroom facilities between families or households. And with the white British group on the far left, we can see that levels of housing deprivation are greater for other ethnic groups, and particularly for non-white minority groups. And what this chart also shows is patterns by time of immigration. So for each ethnic group, the left-hand light grey bar is housing deprivation, the proportion of the group in housing deprivation for those who were born in the UK. And the right-hand dark bar for each ethnic group is immigrants who arrived recently in the late 2000s. For all ethnic groups, recent immigrants have the highest levels of housing deprivation. For example, if we take the Bangladeshi group, which has highest levels of housing deprivation overall, 42% of Bangladeshis who were born in the UK live in housing deprivation. And this rises to 53% for Bangladeshis who have migrated since 2007, who have immigrated since 2007. Now, these patterns remain if we model housing deprivation, taking account of age, occupational social class, tenure, household and accommodation type. In other words, the differences seen here between ethnic and migration groups are not due to the age and class differences between those groups. These inequalities are stubborn, they're persisting over time and between migrant generations. So in sum, ethnic minorities and migrants in Britain are severely disadvantaged in housing. This disadvantage is persisting, indeed increasing, and I argue constitutes a threat to home for migrants and minorities. If we're to address this, which I think we need to, we have to understand how and why these inequalities are produced. I want to focus here on two studies and to summarise the findings of them. And first is a review of housing and migration policy, which led my co-authors and I to conclude that discriminatory processes towards migrants and minorities in all sectors of housing are systemic and slippery, in that they can be difficult to precisely evidence and challenge, particularly as they have become embedded and normalised over a long period. And tackling this is hampered by the fragmented housing sector and anti-migrant polity. And in this project, we charted how migrants have been increasingly differentiated in housing law since the 1940s and in immigration and citizenship legislation that has relevance for housing. I won't go into the details of this chart and this review just now, but I do direct you to this paper if you want a more detailed description of the policy changes which have cumulatively and increasingly excluded migrants and minorities in terms of housing rights. Part of this project was workshops with key stakeholders in migrant and minority housing. And this highlighted particular concerns of exclusion. For example, the stakeholders were really concerned about the increase in market rents in regenerated urban areas, particularly because this was reducing access to housing in those areas for anybody who had an entitlement to social welfare support for housing. And this echoes the work of Tim Butler about race and regeneration and his studies on East London. The workshop participants are also concerned in a similar manner to the distortion of local housing markets by student populations, echoing again the work of Darren Smith and ideas of studentification and the impacts on local housing markets. A major concern for our participants was the local connection rule for the provision of housing. Social housing generally, and including a provision for homeless people. And this basic idea echoes some of Elena's comments and discussion about belonging, who belongs to a particular place, be that a local area, a city or a nation. And this local connection rule says that local housing goes to local people. However, there is considerable local variation in how legislation is applied, which we might interpret in terms of Social's ideas of spatial injustice. For example, in many, perhaps most London boroughs, there is a requirement of 3 to 5 years of residency within the borough before you have an entitlement to social housing, therefore by default excluding recent migrants. However, in Greater Manchester, just a couple of 100 miles away, there is no residency requirement on access to social housing. So from this study, we see the very long and deep roots of exclusion of migrants and minorities in housing policy and practice. The second study serves to demonstrate how racialised housing practices are embedded and localised. So we narrow down the scale here to work in 4 locations within Britain with residents and community and housing workers. And we draw in what I'll present now on around 60 interviews. And these were undertaken over a period of a couple of years in Cheetham Hill in Manchester, in Newham in London, in Cardiff area of Bute Town, and Pollokshields and Govan Hill in Glasgow, areas that share the characteristic of being exceptionally diverse ethnically in a British context. I want to make several points from this work that helps us understand how experiences of housing disadvantage are localised and racialised, remembering Social's notions of spatial justice. First, we found that in the 4 localities, there were quite different imaginaries of diversity, different self-identities of their diversity. In all of them, race and ethnicity were clearly employed by housing and community workers and residents as markers of community, but this was presented differently across the towns. For example, there was a perception of convivial mixing in Newham and Cheetham Hill. The idea that being super diverse meant there were very few problems of racism and conflict. This was the dominant narrative. However, in Glasgow and Cardiff, in Pollokshields and Bute Town, there was much more explicit focus on ethnicity, community engagement and community tensions. The second finding to highlight is that the supposedly inclusive actions to build community in these places were frequently not regarded in this way by residents. Some of the engagement activities were considered exclusionary. And this quote illustrates the emphasis on behaviour change and the dominant approach of creating certain versions of neighbourly behaviour. So this housing association representative in Glasgow says, oh, that's looking to promote behaviour change, raising awareness around looking at the appearance of the neighbourhood and environment, recycling, energy efficiency, fire safety, being neighbourly, and a range of activities. So trying to make it fun and interactive and promote tenant engagement, but trying to look at changing behaviour. So the question arises here of whose idea of neighbourly behaviour is being advocated. And a common theme from the fieldwork was the selectivity of the engagement and the participation in events. As this resident described of one event, I just sort of walked in and it was like there's 200 people here and 195 of them are white. How's this a Govan Hill gathering? And there was about 3 Asian people, and then the other 2 was this older Romanian Roma man, and the lass who'd come to translate for them, and that was it. And it was horrific. We might see this type of event as a result of the discriminatory decision making that Soja speaks of. And there were further frustrations from our participants, both residents and housing and community workers, that the attempts for cross-sector working were really rather ineffective. With a hub which brings the police and social workers and housing and all that together, they do some good work and they're pretty good, but it's been more about a typical political response about let's be seen to be doing something rather than addressing it. And the difficulties of service provision and effective cross-sector working have been considerably exacerbated by austerity policies over recent years, which have particularly affected local government and the voluntary and community sectors. This regeneration officer comments on how this has affected his work in Manchester. We're having to work in a different way, which is about bringing in investment and residential growth and stuff like that. But I think we do our very best to engage and talk to people. It's at the heart of what we try and do. There might be limitations on that in terms of resources that we have to do that. I mean, go back a few years, I spent a lot of my time out and about in communities, talking to people, going to meetings, doing stuff quite actively. And a lot of my time now is sitting at a desk because we don't have the offices anymore. Ultimately, community and housing workers and residents were concerned that fundamental issues in diverse communities, including racism, were not being addressed. As this resident comments, sharing a cupcake with somebody along the street party doesn't make you friends for life, doesn't mean you still don't have racist views. So to summarise and conclude, minorities and migrants are clearly disadvantaged in housing, and persistently so. And I argue that this constitutes a threat to home in a material sense, and thus a threat to ontological and physical well-being. We might even push this idea, if we follow Somerville, to suggest that minorities are being driven to homelessness. I tried to illustrate some of the ways in which these disadvantages are reproduced through the cumulative exclusions and boundary making in national housing and immigration policy and law, and in local implementations of community cohesion agendas. I argue that this combination of disadvantage and racialized policy enactment constitutes spatial injustice at local resolution. And this is extremely concerning at this particular juncture in time, where the UK is battling health and economic crises in a political context of withdrawal from the European Union and renewed anti-migrant narratives. The time, I think, is ripe to shout loud about these disadvantages, injustices, and stubborn inequalities. They should not be left unaddressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nissa, for your research, sharing with us this information on inequalities. Also, in addition to what Dr. Jankic was saying, that inequalities are also very sensitive issue and affecting mostly the minority groups. We can now receive the questions from the participants. However, I would like to start with a question for Dr. Jelena Jankic. Could you please tell us more about the topic that you emphasized on the seal of the passports, which intrigued me? Or could you also compare this to the other mechanisms of the acquisition of passports?
Yes, that's a very good and very interesting question for starters. And please, I expect the audience not to be shy, so do send your questions along in the Q&A section of the chat. So now, if you think about how passports are normally acquired, so most of us, so over 90% of the world's population acquires their passports by right of birth. And this essentially can happen either by being born to parents who are citizens or by being born on a country's territory. Now, if you take a look, and this is something, and I've typed the website, globalcit.eu, where you can actually compare and play with the data. In most of the world's countries, let's say the dominant mode of acquisition is through jus sanguinis, meaning through descent. Quite a lot of countries nowadays also allows the acquisition of citizenship for foundlings, meaning for children who are born with parents are unknown, or children born presumably stateless, to acquire citizenship through jus soli, and immigrant societies, including the United States, but also quite a lot of places, quite a lot of countries in South America also give citizenship on the basis of jus soli as the primary attribution mechanism. Now, on top of this, there are different ways of naturalizing in a state. So, and always to be able to naturalize in a country, an individual is required to meet certain conditions. So, for instance, if you marry in a state, marriage is the key basis for you to acquire that country's citizenship, but you also need to meet additional conditions. And this kind of primary basis for the acquisition of another country's citizenship is called the functional grounds for the acquisition of citizenship, or as Alex Shachar would call it, jus nexi. Now, dysfunctional grounds, which can be, as I said, it can be marriage, it can be adoption, it can be descent. You may have grandparents in a different country. You may have also at some point rendered some sort of a service to the new country, etc., is coupled by other conditions. And these other conditions can include you having to learn and or pass a language test, you not having a criminal condition, you being able to maintain yourself, so having enough money and not relying on social benefits. In the United Kingdom, there's also, for instance, a civics test, which is called Life in the UK. So you need to, in a way, demonstrate that you're somehow connected to the society. In most of these cases, quite a lot of countries apply these mechanisms for naturalization in parallel. And in most of these cases, the one that gets to change is the number of years of residence that are formally required between an applicant receives actual residence status in the country and the acquisition of citizenship. So just to give you an example, in Italy, where I'm currently based, as a third country non-EU national, you can obtain Italian citizenship after 10 years of residence, passing a language test, being a good citizen in the sense of not having criminal convictions, blah, 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 all of those things. If you are an EU citizen seeking naturalization in Italy, on the basis of the fact that you're an EU citizen, you will need only 4 years of residence, right? And if you've married, you're an Italian national, you can receive Italian citizenship after 2 years of residence. So you see how this condition of residence essentially gets diminished for the different naturalization grounds. Now, in the cases of the sale of passports, and this is what essentially creates the long-distance citizens, the residence condition is either not existent, as is the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, Commonwealth of Dominica, etc., or that amounts to a formal registration, meaning a paper that you submit with your citizenship application. So I think that this is where the creation of long-distance citizens through investment-based naturalization differs from other mechanisms for the acquisition of citizenship. Also, I think the core problematic aspect, if you wish to go to a more conceptual theoretical discussion, the second problematic aspect of these programs compared to other naturalization mechanisms are the, in a way, inequalities of membership